Leuk nieuws, want er komen 28 extra voorstellingen in nieuwe Nederlandse theaters. Het eerste theaterseizoen van mijn Oersterk theatertour was compleet uitverkocht. En ik ben enorm dankbaar voor alle positieve reacties. Op vele verzoek komt er een reprise, dus een tweede seizoen. Van september 2024 tot en met april 2025. Met andere woorden, jij krijgt nieuwe kansen om mijn show alsnog te komen bijwonen. Wat levert dit je op? Een concreet en simpel stappenplan om jouw zelfzorg te optimaliseren. Maar vooral een uniek avondje uit met kennis, inspiratie en humor wat bijdraagt aan een sterker lijf en een betere wereld. Dit is belangrijker dan ooit, want de volksgezondheid staat steeds meer onder druk. Vanuit de officiële instanties leren we nergens over hoe we goed voor ons lichaam en brein kunnen zorgen. Niemand komt je redden, dus je bent zelf verantwoordelijk. Is gezondheid ook jouw grootste kapitaal? Zet dan een eerste stap en kom naar mijn show met vrienden, familie of collega's. Want ook zij verdienen meer vitaliteit, toch? Graag tot snel bij een van de aankomende 28 theatershows.
My name is Mark Gober and you are listening to the Primal Power Podcast.
Je hebt een druk bestaan en je wordt vaak geleefd. Je lijf en geest zoeken rust omdat je alles maar geeft. Goed nieuws, dit is jouw moment. Versterk je gezondheid en geluk met een lach. De rode loper ligt weer uit richting een stralende dag. Je voelt je oersterk met Richard de Let.
My name is Richard de Let and I'm the founder of the lifestyle platform Oersterk, which means Primal Power. We are based in the Netherlands. Our guest of today is Mark Gober. He was a New York investment banker, a partner of a Silicon Valley company, and is now the author of the Upside Down series of 6 books, including An End to Upside Down Medicine, with the subtitle Why Consciousness is Needed for a New Paradigm of Health. I'm eager to know more about his tips for a better life. So let's start.
De Oersterk podcast. Een ontdekkingstocht naar een beter leven.
Mark, welcome.
Richard, thanks for having me here.
Yeah, great to have you here in the studio in Heemskerk. In 2018, you wrote the book An End to Upside Down Thinking. It won the IPPY Award for the Best Science Book of the Year. What did you decide to write this book, coming from a very different background?
Yeah, well, I worked in the business world. So after graduating from Princeton University in 2008, I worked at UBS Investment Bank in New York. And then I worked in Silicon Valley advising technology-focused companies. So what we'll talk about today has nothing to do with any of that. But when I was working in Silicon Valley in 2016, I was listening to podcasts. Initially, they were like the Tim Ferriss show, so listening to all sorts of things, venture capitalists, but also some health. And that led me to look at alternative health. And I was listening to a show called Extreme Health Radio, which is still on the air. And there was a woman named Laura Powers talking about very alternative things like psychic ideas that she actually worked with clients using psychic abilities to help them. So I was just curious about what was going on there. And I learned that there was actually a lot of science to validate what she was saying. And she has her own podcast, Healing Powers, where there are many other guests. So long story short, I developed a new worldview based on everything I was learning. And then I decided to write a book that was called An End to Upside Down Thinking. And that's led me on a path to now write many other books.
Yeah, we will talk about that, especially 2 books. You graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University, where you wrote an award-winning thesis on Daniel Kahneman's Nobel Prize-winning prospect theory. Now you said you worked in New York as an investment banker, and you was also a partner of a Silicon Valley company. What have the experiences in these sectors taught you?
Well, I've learned, number one, in my job, I had to take a lot of information and synthesize it to bring it to audiences that have a short attention span. So when I'm presenting in my job, when I used to work there, I would present to a board of directors, and they're busy with many other things. So they want the point, they want the quick version. So I'd take a lot of information and not lose any of the integrity of what was there, but synthesize. And that's what I try to do with my books, is to bring everything together. But I also learned a lot about the dynamics of of industry, of how that there are powerful players who can try to suppress competition. And I saw this with technology. If there was a small company with a new innovation that would challenge the industry, the existing players would try to squash that company. So we did a lot in my Silicon Valley job with patented technologies. So we spent time in courtrooms even, or fighting over who invented what and whether there was patent infringement. And I saw that the big companies had a big advantage in terms of squashing competitors, but also utilizing the media and even corruption in the court systems. And I think it was an important lesson for me, because that happens all over the place. And we see it in the medical space too, where the pharmaceutical industry has such a big advantage in swaying the mind of the public as to what health is, versus many alternative ideas that you talk about to actually bring about health and get to the root cause.
Yeah, let's dive into that, because you wrote 6 books in total.
Actually 7. There was one that just came out a few days ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
6 books in total, including the book An End to Upside Down Medicine. You wrote that book in 2023. You write in the introduction, modern medicine isn't working. The primary aim of this book is to shine light on the core flaws of the mainstream Western approach to health, known as allopathic medicine, and instead point toward a new and improved paradigm. The current model is actively perpetrated by the pharmaceutical industry, doctors, the media, politicians, and academia, while many everyday citizens go along with it without asking questions. And why did you write this book about medicine?
Well, when I started my research, let's say in 2016, my first book was about consciousness. It wasn't about medicine per se, but the topic was relevant back then too, because I learned about alternative ideas like energy healing and acupuncture, things that are actually ancient ways of looking at health, but also nutrition and meditation, and seeing that there was more than just taking a pill that could improve health. But then when everything happened with COVID starting in 2020, there were lots of questions about what's causing disease, how serious is disease, how do we cure it, how do we think about jabs? I don't want to use the word on YouTube, but are those healthy? What are the risks and benefits? So I was asking many questions around that era too, that combined with my research on consciousness, and I said, now it's the time to write a book about this.
Yeah, but because in this book you challenge different core assumptions about health and disease. Can you mention some assumptions that are maybe different or even not true in your vision? Okay.
Well, let's say one, maybe the most controversial one, is about the role of germs in disease. Because it's a topic where, as I researched it, I realized there were a lot of inferences and assumptions being made based on things we're told. So one is, let's say, bacteria. We know that in nature, bacteria can be helpful. They can help to decompose dead and dying things. And when there's a lot of bacteria in the body and a person has symptoms, we say that person has an infection and we have to treat the infection, there's nothing wrong with that per se. But the question is whether the bacteria are the agent that are causing the disease, or the bacteria are showing up because there's some underlying problem and the bacteria are cleaning it up. In which case, treating the bacteria might be important because there's such an issue there, and the bacteria can have toxins, the endotoxins. But if we wanted to get to the root cause, we'd have to ask, well, why were the bacteria there in the first place? Was there some kind of underlying toxicity that caused the bacteria there to try to clean it up? And is that toxicity, is it psychological, psycho-spiritual? Is it a physical toxin? That's one question I wanted to ask, because I had never thought about that before. I would have just said, well, the bacteria were the bad guys there. But maybe the bacteria were just there and they got blamed for something they didn't do. So that's one category. The other that's a big debate these days is about viruses. Because as I looked into the history of viruses, the term actually means poison. The term eos, it comes from the Greeks. And there have been many questions throughout history. So Louis Pasteur, for example, when he was looking at rabies, he saw lots of symptoms. He definitely saw dogs and humans getting sick, and he couldn't find something that was being transmitted, but he said there must be something there. And so there was this idea that there was a transmissible agent that could go from one organism to another. And then the electron microscope was developed starting in the 1930s, and then later it became more popular to be able to see something so small, because a bacteria is actually a bigger organism than a virus is believed to be. And in the 1954, this is really the core study that I had never heard about, the Enders and Peebles study, which is now known to be basically the gold standard for how viruses are isolated. Now, the issue is that the way they use the term isolation is different than the everyday meaning. Because when I look up isolation in the dictionary, it means to separate one thing from other things. So Dr. Tom Cowan, who's a medical doctor who's been speaking out about this, he says if you have a toolkit with a hammer and screwdriver and nails, if you want to isolate the hammer, you take the hammer out of the toolkit, and then you can study the hammer, you can characterize it, all those things. Very basic. But that's not actually the way it's done with viruses. And I mention this because even with SARS-CoV-2, there are lots of beliefs about it, but people still get sick. We haven't come up with a treatment for these symptoms, and many other viruses we could talk about. We certainly haven't come up with a perfect idea for it, and that's why I think it's important to look at these studies, because something seems to be off. So what they do in the study, the 1954 study, and I should say, Enders, one of the men who wrote this study, he's a Nobel Prize winner. So this got a lot of attention. They took fluids from a person who was sick. In this case, it was measles. And I'm simplifying this. Anyone can look up the paper, but it's basically they took fluids from a person who was sick, and then they put it in a soup of cellular material. It's called a cell culture. And this soup has things like antibiotics, monkey kidney cells, a lot of other things in the soup. You put fluids from a sick person into this soup, known as the cell culture, and the scientists looked to see whether or not the cells broke down in this soup. And the inference was, if the cells broke down in the soup, there must have been a virus in the fluids from the sick person, and that's why the cells broke down. And to them, when they see cells breaking down, they say, we have isolated the virus. The problem from a logical perspective is that you would need to have just a virus from the sick person, isolating it actually first. Some would call it a purified sample. And then you would know that if you added that, you could tell that it's a virus doing something, versus other things from a sick person that could be in their fluids. Because if someone's sick, who knows? There's all sorts of cellular material there. So that's one issue. And the other issue is that in this cell culture soup, there are a lot of things there. There's antibiotics, monkey kidney cells, and other things that could be toxic. So what would be important to do is to see, well, do cells break down if you didn't add anything to it? Or if you added something that's more neutral, would the cells break down? And what I was shocked to find is that there's a lot of sloppiness in the scientific method, because basic science says we should have an independent variable, right, in a study, because we introduce something into a study and we see what the effect is on the environment, and we should also have proper controls. But in order to have a proper control, you need to know what you're controlling against, meaning you need to have the independent variable first. Meaning you would, in this case, you'd want to have just virus and then introduce it. So this is a big problem for the field of virology, because now this is the method that's used, basically the cell culture method of isolation. And this became a big question during the COVID era, because people were getting sick. We didn't understand exactly why. And then there was a lot of talk about a vaccination to help people. But first we need to have a virus to know what's causing it. And actually a woman named Christine Massey in Canada has worked with colleagues all over the world asking for this isolation, meaning just the virus, the actual purification of having an independent variable. Is that being done for SARS-CoV-2, the virus believed to cause COVID? And what they're saying is, well, we don't have it in the way you're asking because we always use the cell culture method. And that's just one, virus that's believed to exist. She's done this with many others too. So it's made me ask a lot of questions. Well, let's just say maybe in some of these cases it's not a virus that's going from person to person. Could there be another cause of why people get sick? Could it be more complex than just a little microscopic organism that's believed to be there? Could there be toxins in the environment? Could there be electromagnetic issues? Could there be nutritional issues? And then I'm really interested in the consciousness aspect. Could there be things in people's psychology that's causing sickness too? And I think the allopathic approach tends to be very reductionistic, where it likes to find one cause, and then you have one pill or one shot that you take to make it better. But what if health is much more complex than that? Where people do get sick, absolutely they get sick and they can die because of symptoms, but maybe the reason that the symptoms show up is not exactly what we think.
Yeah, I really love the fact that you were writing in a lot of chapters about germs, about viruses, about the power of consciousness. Do you get reactions from medical doctors or even maybe the medical system on your book?
I haven't gotten too many, interestingly. Maybe because the book only came out within the last year. But when I've spoken to doctors one-on-one, what I find is that if I say to them, for example, how do you know that a virus exists and causes disease? And they'll think about it. And they'll say, well, because we did a PCR test, which is a genetic test, basically. And then they realize, they say, well, that's based on, if they don't have a sample of just a virus, then the genetic material that they are getting from that test, well, maybe it's not a virus. Maybe there's other stuff in there from the body. And then they realize, well, actually, I'm not sure about it, because in med school, we just assume certain things to be true, and we were told how to treat it based on symptoms. And what I found over and over again is that the foundational papers, they came many decades ago. Or even some of the studies on contagion, where some of the scientists tried to show that there was a particle that goes from one person to another and causes illness. Like the Spanish flu, there were the Rosenau studies where the scientists had people cough in each other's faces, one person who was sick and another person who was healthy, and they couldn't transmit the symptoms. So what many of the doctors I've talked to found is they just assume certain things to be true. They haven't looked back at the foundational studies, and they say, well, Mark, what you're saying is hard for me to believe, but I would have to go back to those studies. And it is true that often if someone comes to my office with symptoms and we don't understand it, we say, well, it's probably just viral, as if that's an explanation for it, where there's a lot they admit they don't know.
Because they don't know.
Because they don't know.
Yeah. No, because I'm, as a human being, I'm always curious. I think I already was in my medical education program, so I ask a lot of questions, and a lot of people and doctors will get some discomfort about asking too many questions. Is that also something that you experience, especially in the old paradigm medical world?
When I talk to doctors about it, absolutely. They feel like it's risky for them to speak up against the system. Since the Flexner report of 1910, this was a report that anyone can read online. It's very lengthy, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. It basically changed how medicine was done, because previously there was more openness toward homeopathic approaches or osteopathic approaches, and more things that were related to ancient civilizations, really, ancient practices of health. And that all changed, where the medical system went toward the allopathic approach, which likes to focus on just the symptoms rather than the root cause, doesn't like to think about consciousness as much as more just the physical issues, reductionistic. So that's been the approach. So to get into that system, as you know, it's very challenging to get into med school. You have to be very smart, you have to follow the rules, and then at least in America, you get into med school, then there's a residency, then there's a fellowship. Just to get through that, is there really time to ask questions? And if you want to do well in that system, to challenge the system itself can be problematic. And the medical system itself is influenced by the pharmaceutical industry, because doctors, and I quoted one woman in the book, she says, I realized that I basically became a technician of the pharmaceutical industry. She learned how to administer their medications. So I think for doctors it is very challenging to speak up, but there have been many brave doctors like yourself who have been asking questions, and to get out of the system to really try to get to the root cause of what makes us healthy.
Yeah, because when we go back to the psychology and consciousness, the Western allopathic approach typically considers the human to be an exclusively physical entity rather than a spiritual one. The title of part 2 of your book is Why is Consciousness Relevant to Medicine? Mm-hmm. What is the relationship for you between the brain, the mind, and consciousness? Mm-hmm.
Well, let me just preface this by saying I studied psychology at Princeton, and I didn't know this was even a question, because I assumed that because we know so much about neuroscience and the way the brain works, that we know that our consciousness just comes from our brain. It's inside of our skull. And what I mean by consciousness is our awareness, basically. It's a difficult thing to describe because I can't point to it and show it to you. It's an abstraction, but you have a consciousness right now. It's the part of you that's experiencing this whole conversation. Every member of your audience has a consciousness. So this is a very big deal. The question is whether the brain is producing it. And we know the brain is correlated to consciousness, meaning if a person, let's say, has a car accident damaging the part of the brain that's responsible for vision, we see the person has a change in their vision, we can say, look, this part of your brain changed, your vision changed, Therefore, the brain creates consciousness. And the problem in statistics, people say correlation does not imply causation. It could be that the brain is more like an antenna that's receiving our consciousness from outside. And that was a very big concept for me. I'd never thought about that before. That means, what if our identity really is beyond our body, and our body is a vessel for it? And that's been a theme in all of my books, to explain the relationship between the brain and consciousness. Because the brain, under this alternative concept, is still very important, because it's an apparatus that receives it or filters and processes consciousness, but it's not producing it. And let me just give one more analogy that really helped me when I started. When you watch a television set, if there's an antenna that's receiving a signal, and that's allowing you to watch your TV show, if you took a hammer and smashed the antenna, all of a sudden your TV show would be very scratchy on the screen. It's not because the signal was damaged. All that happened was that the machinery that was processing the interface for the signal was damaged. The signal's fine. In the same way that if we damage the brain, maybe our consciousness isn't the problem. It's just the apparatus that was the interface for consciousness that has shifted. Now, this has massive implications, because it would imply that the body is not the producer of our consciousness, but it's the vessel, the vehicle for it. And I emphasize this in the realm of health, because if the allopathic approach fundamentally misunderstands what a human being is, then how can we get medicine right? If our identity is beyond our body, that means that our body's the vessel for it. That means we have to look at the body very differently. And then we might even wonder how our consciousness shifts could affect our body. Is there some relationship there? These are questions that I don't often hear allopathic doctors talking about.
Yeah, because it has huge implication of almost reinventing the medical system and to make it future-proof. Yeah, because I love the sentence in the chapter of consciousness continues even in the absence of a brain.
Yeah.
That's for a regular medical doctor mind-blowing, of course.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah,
and well, it was mind-blowing for me too. That's why I started to write, because I thought about that. Wait, could your consciousness continue to exist even when your body dies and shuts off? Is that possible? Because if that's true, then it made me rethink, well, what does it mean? What is a human being? And some of the best examples of this comes from near-death experience research, and many very credible doctors have looked at this, including Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel, Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia. They examine people who have been in cardiac arrest or are very near death. I mean, their body is sometimes clinically dead, and yet the person's consciousness is realer than real. That's what they say. So it's a paradox. This is actually, I interviewed Dr. Bruce Grayson for my podcast series, Where is My Mind?, which is still available on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Dr. Bruce Grayson said to me, Mark, we're left with this paradigm that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever. So what the implication is that the brain might actually get in the way of an expanded consciousness. It actually limits us. And when people come back from these near-death experiences, when they're resuscitated, and not everyone's resuscitated because they might have died from the trauma, but when they are resuscitated, they often describe an out-of-body experience, meaning that their consciousness was liberated from their body and they're seeing things from the ceiling and looking down at what happened. And they come back in their body and they tell the doctor what happened. The doctor says, you got it right, but that's impossible because you should have been dead, clinically dead, and even if there was a little bit of brain functioning, it shouldn't be enough for you to accurately remember what happened, let alone seeing it from the ceiling looking down. So these are verified memories, meaning that they're not hallucinations, which to me gives a lot of credibility to these experiences. And there's a book called The Self Does Not Die, which aggregates over 100 of these cases of verified memories of being out of the body during a near-death experience, which is pointing to what you just said, that the mind can continue, the consciousness can continue in the absence of a brain.
Yeah, because you mentioned your podcast, Where is My Mind? The announcement of the podcast on your website states this. Why does this show matter? Well, if consciousness is not native to the brain, would phenomena like telepathy, precognition, near-death experiences, after-death communications, and so much more not only be possible, but be predicted. Plus, what happens when we die? Are physics real? How could a young child accurately report memories of someone else's life and death? The implication could shift our collective worldview and even impact how we treat one another. So don't miss it. Has this quest personally made you less afraid of death?
Yeah, absolutely. From an intellectual perspective, I would tell you that I don't fear death, but we still have bodies that want to survive. So there is a bodily fear, just an instinct, an ego fear that comes up. But conceptually speaking, if these things are true, and I think there's a lot of evidence it is true, then the fear of death that I used to have doesn't exist, for sure.
Yeah, but in your 2019 podcast series, Where's My Mind? It explores the science of consciousness, and you interviewed world-leading thinkers. What did you learn from the thinkers about the mind?
Well, it's interesting. I did the podcast series after writing my book and into Upside Down Thinking. So I came into the podcast already with a bias that my worldview had shifted. I thought that consciousness is beyond the body. But there was something about interviewing all of these credible people rather than just reading their work or watching them on YouTube, to get to ask them myself. I interviewed about 50 people, including Brian Josephson, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Dr. Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, Eben Alexander, Harvard neurosurgeon, very smart people from all over the world, and they're telling me the same thing with a lot of conviction, especially like someone like Eben Alexander, Harvard-trained neurosurgeon, to come out and say, I had a near-death experience, I was in a coma, and I experienced a realer-than-real reality, and I'm telling you, consciousness does not come from the brain. That's a very brave thing for someone to do. And to hear about his experience firsthand and see how it changed his life, that had a deeper effect on me, for sure. Because hearing it from someone directly is a little bit different.
Yeah, I can imagine. And did you get an answer to the big question, where's my mind?
Not a firm answer, but I would say now that the mind is everything. Erwin Schrödinger, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said, in truth, there is only one mind. And I think that is probably the nature of reality in some way, that there's one consciousness that we're all a part of. Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher, describes it this way, that there's like a stream of water, an infinite stream of water, and each of us is like a whirlpool within the stream. So we're an individuated form of consciousness, if we view the whole stream to be consciousness. And that's the paradox, that there's the individual within the collective. They're both true at the same time. We're individuals, but we're all interconnected. I think there's something like that. So where's my mind? It's both within the whirlpool, but it's beyond the whirlpool. And if we take that analogy a bit further, imagine if some of the water from my whirlpool gets into your whirlpool. By analogy, some of my consciousness getting into yours, that's like a psychic ability. So things like telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, that's a completely expected phenomenon. Or if we say, a whirlpool stops being a whirlpool, it delocalizes, the water flows back into the broader stream. That would be like if someone's body dies, their consciousness doesn't die. It transitions into a new form and stays within the stream, and actually could reform into a new whirlpool, meaning reincarnation. So all of these ideas that I used to think were just crazy science fiction, psychic phenomena, life after death, reincarnation, all of that changes. All of it becomes predicted and very much possible if we shift our view of consciousness. So it all goes back to, does consciousness come from the brain? Because if consciousness comes from the brain, pops out of our skull, then all those things are impossible. But if we shift the view of consciousness and say the mind is everywhere, then all these other things are possible. And then we have to rethink medicine.
Yeah, because it's huge. When do you think... is the world ready, or when does the world have this mental flexibility to listen, even to consider other options of reality?
It starts with each person. What I find is that the person has to want to ask questions, and it can't be forced on people. I've learned this now because my seventh book just came out, and I have a different perspective than when my first book came out, where I said, look, there's so much science here. Just look at the evidence. There's no way to dispute it. There's too much. Peer-reviewed papers, doctors all over the world, the U.S. government using psychic spying and having declassified documents validating it. How could you ever dispute this? And yet I have a lot of very smart friends and people I know who will look at it and say, no, this can't be true, and they stop. So I think there's something that has to be lit, a fire within, and then programs like this and books are available for the people that are willing.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people do not appreciate their health. They come to a point most of the times that they have lost a part of their health, and they start to think about health, about the mind, about consciousness. What is your vision on mind-matter interaction and healing?
I think the mind is much more influential in health than we have been taught. And there's a reason that this is so challenging for the allopathic approach, because the allopathic approach starts with physical stuff and thinks that everything comes from that, including consciousness, meaning our physical brain produces consciousness. But an analogy here, it's almost like billiard balls. One ball hits the next. You can see the chain of events. Whereas if we talk about a mindset shift, it's much more abstract. We can't point to the billiard balls making the effect. And yet there can be an effect from a mindset shift. So I'll give an example. One of the most extreme cases, Anita Morjani. She was dying of terminal cancer, had tumors all over her body, and had a near-death experience where her consciousness was expanded. But what happened there was that her consciousness shifted about herself. So when she was resuscitated, her tumors disappeared. A consciousness shift, her mindset shifted, and then her tumors, which were physical things, went away.
She wrote a book about it.
Yeah, Dying to Be Me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she left the allopathic system and she healed. That shouldn't happen, according to modern medicine. And there are many other cases of spontaneous remissions, where often there is a mindset shift that changes physical symptoms. And there's an emerging field called German New Medicine, which I think is an important one to be studied further, the work of Dr. Hammer in Germany, where he basically has found that there can be emotional conflicts, shocks to the emotion, that translate to lesions in the brain that can be seen on brain scans, which translate to the organ. So now what the practitioners have done is they can say, because they've seen so many of the brain scans, you have this physical symptom, this is the emotional shock that conflicted you, let's work on this emotion or these beliefs around it. So I do think these approaches are important because our mind, I think it also is very intuitive for many of us that sometimes when we're stressed, we can see that our health, our physical health is not as good. But if you go to the doctor, they might tell you, don't be so stressed, but just take this pill. And maybe that will help the symptoms in the short term. But really, we have to get to the fundamentals of our psychology to get to the core of health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just said it starts with the person. So it starts in you. I read in your book that you are writing, one might wonder, could large groups of people holding the same negative mindset, such as fear, create a negative outcome in the world? Could they induce or encourage sickness during pandemics? This would be occurring in a seemingly non-linear and invisible manner beyond our everyday perceptions. And so can we as a society and collectively use our healing capabilities. Capabilities, thank you. I will start again. Use our healing capabilities much better, and why don't we learn this anywhere?
Yeah. Well, I want to take a few steps back to give your audience some context here, because it sounds a little bit crazy that if our collective mindset shifts, that we could shift health collectively, doesn't make sense. But if we say that consciousness is the basis of reality, like the stream of water, if it's something like that, then it would make sense conceptually that reality is just a manifestation of consciousness. And therefore reality, what we call physical, is actually somewhat malleable. And there are some scientific studies which suggest that this is true. One is called the Global Consciousness Project, and this was a spin-out of work that was done at Princeton University. It was a lab run by Dr. Robert John, the former Dean of Engineering at Princeton. So very credible people were doing this. And Dr. John has passed away, but Dr. Roger Nelson has continued the work. I interviewed him for my podcast too, where they have set up machines all over the world. These are called random number generators. So the machine generates a 1 or a 0 over and over again, and it's totally random. So over time, the machines are 50% ones, 50% zeros because it's random. what the researchers do is they look at what happens in the world to these machines. They just set them up, and all day long, ones and zeros. But they say, when there's a major global event, like 9/11, or Princess Diana's death, some major event where they think people's consciousness will shift in a similar direction, do the machines behave differently? Is it not 50% ones, 50% zeros? Is it a little bit more? And what they find is that the machines do behave non-randomly. It's a small effect, but it's statistically significant. And the implication that they believe so far is that when there's a collective shift in consciousness, the physical machines behave differently. Something changes. There's an energy. We don't fully understand it. And this also relates to what's known as the Maharishi effect, where when large groups of people meditate, there are changes in the amount of crime, for example, or there's more peace. There's a book called An Antidote to Violence, which goes through 20 peer-reviewed studies on the Maharishi effect. So the point is there is some science that suggests that the physical world can be affected by mindset, and therefore we have to ask questions because we saw so much fear around COVID, and we see this with so many other illnesses. The fear aspect of it, how much of that is actually playing in to the symptoms? We don't think about it typically, the fear, because an allopathic approach would say, well, we can't touch fear. We can't show that that's a billiard ball hitting another one. But what if there's something happening that we can't see with our eyes that's actually affecting the physical?
Yeah, I think we all experience it, the power of the fear worldwide during the pandemics.
Yes.
Yeah. What would you do as a secretary of Upside Down Medicine? Because I think that maybe small steps we need to change the medical system, maybe we need to change society, but...
I think it starts with all of us asking questions, including members of your audience. Because the system is going to do its thing. The system is incentivized for us to have very specific beliefs because there are financial interests involved in it. But it will change if the patients go into the doctor's office and ask new questions and they demand new things from the doctors. And that means the doctors and the medical system would have to shift, or there could be a new paradigm completely outside the system. So for me, it always starts with asking the question, how do I know the thing that I think I know? So if a doctor says, this is why you are sick, it's this condition and it's caused by this, really think about it. Look back at the studies to say, is it true that that's the case? And the medication that they're prescribing, is it true that it will help in the way that they think? Are there other possible causes beyond a germ? Are there toxins? What's my diet like? What's my mindset like? Am I under stress? Am I in situations in life that are not benefiting me? So looking beyond what just the doctor is saying, and then also exploring podcasts like yours and other alternative health mechanisms to have a more holistic approach. Because I think when more people do that, then it will be like a grassroots upswelling to help to shift reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people don't take the effort when a doctor is telling you something to doubt about it. But also when I'm looking at your 7 books, you can become quite insecure or maybe even crazy about the world because what's true and what's not true and
yeah, sure.
There isn't much to hold on. People really love to believe also something when a doctor is telling you when it's true. You don't have to do things by yourself because it can create a lot of discomfort when you start asking these kind of questions about everything in the universe, not only in the medical system, but how can people take small steps and still feeling grounded?
Well, the question to ask is what's worse? The discomfort associated with asking these questions or going into the system that we know is keeping people sick. The data is the data. Chronic illness is way up there. We have so many, we're not doing well with cancer, heart disease, you name it, diabetes. So something's wrong, and that's our choice. We can just stick with the mainstream system and stay sick, and that's not fun. And it's also can be uncomfortable to ask questions, but I think that's relatively better. So the first step is opening the mind, really, to asking those questions and being willing to take responsibility for your own health. That's another big part of it because it's easier to say, well, I don't want to deal with this. Let me just have this person in a white coat tell me all the answers. But then you pay the price because if that doesn't make you better, then you end up sick.
Yeah, so how do you think about the future of medicine and the current medical industrial complex. You are also writing about that.
Yeah, the future is what we make it to be, because the medical industrial complex has a financial incentive to continue what it's doing. It's just math. So I don't think that's going to change. The change is going to be in the individual's consciousness. And that also starts with parenting. So parents who teach their children that there are alternative ways of looking at it and encouraging their children to be open-minded is going to be critical too.
Because now it's too much about economics and not about health.
Yeah.
Yeah. You are also, and I really like that, writing about electricity and electromagnetic radiation. What is the effect of increased electricity and electromagnetic radiation on our biofield and on our health?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the biofield. That's a very important topic because in the allopathic approach, we don't hear them talking about that very much. But there is some research on that, and Dr. Shamini Jain has written a really good book on the biofield, which basically suggests that there's an electric component to our physical form. And therefore, affecting that electric component, whether it's through electricity that we're exposed to or electric and magnetic fields, EMFs, with all the wireless radiation, that we can actually be affected by that. So it's important for us to just keep in mind those changes that we're seeing in society. There's a book called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg, which goes through the changes in electricity, because there's so much more electricity now than there was in the past, and showing that sometimes we can see there's a correlation between changes in electricity and health. That's something we often don't hear people talking about because it's largely invisible. We don't see this stuff. And it's important to keep in mind that the electromagnetic spectrum of light, the human eye can only see a tiny little fraction. And there's a lot more that we don't see with our eyes. And we tend to be biased toward what we can see. And yet there are all kinds of frequencies coming at us all the time.
What are you doing personally to protect yourself, for example, against electromagnetic frequencies?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a new field where the technologies are more in their infancy. So some people buy cases for their iPhone. I have one for my cell phone. I don't know exactly the mechanisms, but I think trying those things, it's a bit of trial and error to see if it works for you. But then also maybe not holding the phone near the body all day. Some people say that's a smart thing. It seems like a reasonable thing to do. And some people like to turn their Wi-Fi off when they're not using it or turn it off at night. So just being more aware of, well, what's the wireless exposure around me? Is my home located near a big cell tower, for example? Some people will even move their homes to try to be in places like that. And then there are probably new technologies that will emerge, things we can put in our home or even hold on our body that will protect us more. And I think just the awareness of even having this conversation might spark people to then think of new business ideas and new tests they can run on it.
Yeah, because I think it's still quite funny that a lot of medical doctors are telling me, we don't see radiation, so it doesn't exist, and it's not able to do any harm on the body. It's also with emotions. We don't see them. But in your opinion, what's the influence of emotions on our health?
Yeah, I think they're huge. The more I've researched that our emotions the emotions often come from our beliefs and our traumas. So that means if we can make our beliefs more in a direction that keep us happy versus stressed out, our body, it just makes sense, will be more capable of being in a healthy state. Whereas if we're in a constantly stressed or traumatized state, we're going to be less capable of handling things in the world around us, perhaps including electricity and toxicity and EMFs. If we're in a better mental state, maybe we're better able to handle the challenges around us.
Yeah, because as a medical doctor, or also in my practice, whole day you see sick people, and everybody then is talking or searching for healing. What is the essence of healing for you?
To me, it's two broad categories, which is physical injury, and that could be someone who falls down and hurts the bones, but also it could be toxicity and electricity and things like that. So more in the physical area. But then there's also psycho-spiritual injury, and that could be negative emotions, trauma, things beyond that we don't even understand about consciousness. Those to me would be the categories to look at comprehensively for anyone's health.
I really love the word psycho-spiritual injury. I never heard it before. It was amazing. Because we have a lot of toxins around us. What can we do? I think also here the most important thing is consciousness about all the different toxins. But what is the first step also for the people who listen or watch to protect yourself, maybe even in a preventive way, against all the toxins?
Yeah. Well, I think being aware of products that we use, looking at the ingredients and learning more about toxic ingredients that maybe we're not warned about. And then also food sources. Really important to get foods that are clean and free of those toxins. Because many of us, we're busy and we just need to eat, and we don't always look at everything on the label or know what the sources are from. But doing the work up front to say, well, I'm going to get my fruits and vegetables from this place because I know they're cleaned well, for example, and they don't use those toxins. Putting that work up front, and then just that's your source. Starting to ask those questions is really important.
Yeah. For me, self-care is also really important. You travel a lot. You are now a week in the Netherlands. Do you have a daily morning routine, for example?
Right now I don't, because I just finished a book, and when I'm in a book mode, everything goes out the window. But I have found that things like meditation, breathing exercises, and for each person it's different. To find something that puts you in a centered place, it has a bigger effect than many realize. It sounds simple, like just to sit down and focus on your breathing for 10 minutes, but you'd be amazed to see what that does for health and for mental health in particular, because the day becomes a little bit less stressful when the mind is able to handle things that come in. So starting off with that is really important, just some kind of practice. I also find physical exercise really important, that if I'm not working out, I'm just not as sharp, or I don't feel I'm not as happy. So having some kind of physical practice too could be really important.
So you can really feel the intimate relationship between the body and the mind.
I really do feel it.
Yeah. You also wrote a book, it's a second book also standing here in front of me, An End to Upside Down Liberty in 2021. In the preface, you write, upside down liberty is the mistaken belief that we are free when in fact we are not. Our hidden enslavement occurs on two primary levels, the metaphysical and the physical. Can you explain this in a little more depth?
Yes. So in that book, An End to Upside Down Liberty, I challenge the very basic notion of government, which we all grow up thinking that the government is there to protect us, when in fact, I think it objectively has a tyrannical aspect, because it is a political monopoly that we are forced to adhere to. And it can make the rules that we might find to be immoral, and yet it calls that morality through its laws. It is able to take our property, even if we didn't want it to do so. And often we say, well, we have a democratic society, and that's a good thing. The problem with that is, what if the majority becomes tyrannical against the minority and says, you have to do these things? The people in the minority, they're not actually free. So these are things that I had never really thought about before, that we are an inherently enslaved system. And there are different degrees of enslavement, of course, but we're not fully free. And that leads to the metaphysical problems, because on a metaphysical level, I think we're all innately free. When we get into an expanded consciousness, we're not confined to this body. So that becomes problematic, because if our lives are now confined by what a government, a third party tells us to do, even if we didn't vote for that person to do it, and they can still do it to us, what does that limit in terms of our ability to act in the world? And could that affect us on some metaphysical level, because we're not as free here as we thought?
Yeah, because what would the world look like if everyone became libertarian? So when there would be no state.
Yeah.
And maybe you can explain what a libertarian is.
Yes. Yeah. So in the book, often we hear things like free market capitalism. And that means that people can act in the marketplace without the government getting in the way. But they always talk about it, almost always talk about it, with the government still there. So I would argue we never have a free market, because a free market means absolutely free with no third party that's intervening. So I get into my book, An End to Upside Down Liberty, thinking about, well, what if we didn't have the government there at all? Could we function as a society? Acknowledging that we're very far from that today. And some would call this a libertarian society, some would call it voluntarism, some would call it anarcho-capitalism. There are different terms for it. But basically, we have been so conditioned to think that because the government has such important functions, which it does, like the court systems and military, police, a lot of important things, road servicing, that only the government can do those things. But is that true? Because what is the government? It's a service provider, provides services of important things, but there are other service providers like doctors, lawyers, consultants, every other profession basically other than government is able to function. And yet we say these few things, government has to do it. So there's a whole field of theoretical economics, and the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama has done a really good job of putting this information out, of looking at, well, could you have privatized police? Meaning the same things? What's government? It's just a group of people together, and government is no different than any other service provider, except the government has special privileges. So what if we took people in a free marketplace and said, you say, look, I need private security for my area, so you could hire a company, Richard, that does that. And if that company doesn't do a good job, there could be a competitor company. We don't have that in the government because it's a political monopoly. So we end up with a perverse incentive. The government says, let's just say with regard to education, we're not doing a good job with education, therefore we need more money from the taxpayers. What happens in the marketplace if you don't do a good job? You go out of business and another competitor comes in. So with the government, we don't have that, and yet it stays in place because it's always going to be there because it's a monopolistic structure that we have. So I contemplate many of these ideas. What the government's doing, could we bring that to the private market in theory?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because how do you view politics? Because the new elections in America will be in November.
Yeah.
And what is your option about the possible choice between Trump or Harris?
It's hard for me as a libertarian thinker, because to me the government is tyrannical no matter what. I tend to be biased where I think the left right now, so the Democrats in America, are more tyrannical than the right. So my bias is always more toward the right because they're relatively less tyrannical. I think there are problems with both sides, but I worry a lot about the Democrats continuing to be in power in the U.S. because it seems to be steering us more towards socialism, communism, really taking away property rights. And we saw this a lot during the COVID era, where the Democrats tended to be more in favor of the lockdowns, more toward mandating jabs or trying to restrict travel and calling people essential and non-essential workers. And it's in the name typically of compassion. It's a form of weaponized compassion where, well, we're just doing this to protect you. Whereas the right has tended to be, in general, more toward, well, Richard, you make your own decision. I might disagree with that, but if you want to go out of your house without a mask on, that's your prerogative. I lean much more toward that.
Yeah, because I think this is beautiful. David Hawkins put it well. Our contribution to the world is the perfection of our own self. We prioritize our own individual evolution, and as a consequence, we positively impact the world. Should every person make this a priority? Is that our
I think so.
challenge?
But as a libertarian, I wouldn't force that on anyone.
Of course.
But I do think that would be the ultimate solution, is for us to individually make these shifts, to start asking the questions and work on ourselves to become the best version of ourselves, because then we become the best vessel to be able to affect the world. So the work that I do on myself allows me to write better books or do better when I'm in podcast interviews. And that's just one example. This is just my life. But for your audience members to think about what's going on in your life, when you're the best version of yourself, think about the contributions you make. So I love that quote as well, that when we perfect ourselves, we do the best that we can for the world. And I like to think about each person as a puzzle piece, a unique puzzle piece within some kind of a cosmic puzzle, which means you're not the best at everything, and maybe some things you're not good at, but to accept yourself as that puzzle piece and then be the best version of it. That's the best you can do.
Yeah, beautiful. You are now regularly in the media. How's that for you?
It hasn't changed much, actually. I don't hear from that many people. I don't get that much feedback from other people watching in terms of people contacting me. But I think for me, it's very fulfilling because I spend so much time by myself researching this stuff to like get the ideas solidified in my mind and so much time in the writing, editing process. It's fun for me to share the information because, as we talked about at the beginning, my whole journey started listening to podcasts. So I always keep in mind before I go on a show, I never know who's going to hear something, and it could be in 20 years that they hear it, but it could be the first spark, and then they go on their own journey. So I do think it's really important, and for me, it's fulfilling.
Yeah, because you cover a lot of topics. I think you're way ahead in time before the crowd. So do you get also sometimes a stupid question or critic?
Yeah. Oh, I get critics. I get people that are upset with me, and it's an internal journey for myself. And I say this for members of your audience because you might encounter this too. Anytime you go down the road of shifting your own paradigm, that means you're going to be making new decisions, and that might upset the people around you who are based on an old paradigm. So I always have to think to myself, am I willing to publish this new idea? I mean, talking about viruses, for example, that's a very controversial thing. And I had to ask myself, can I do this? Do I have enough evidence? Yes, I do. My newest book is on cosmology. I'm asking all kinds of questions about the universe and Earth that I had never thought about. And I had to go inside and say, can I do this? And ultimately, I make a choice. It's really one where I have to challenge my own integrity. If I see something important that I can back up with evidence and logic, then I do feel like there's a responsibility to go forward, even if people criticize me. So I've gotten better at handling the critiques. And what I do is I say, okay, now I'm learning that these people who are criticizing me were no longer resonating. And the positive side of it, I always find this to be true. A new world opens up here when I make these choices that I didn't even know existed, of new people that resonate with me. So there's a losing in some ways, but maybe those are things that it's better that I lost. And then there's a lot that I gain.
It creates a better balance.
Yes.
Yeah. I always have this question to my Dutch guest in the podcast, but you've written 7 books. You're a public speaker. You have a lot of experience in New York and Silicon Valley. But what is the craziest thing you have ever experienced?
The craziest thing, I'll just give you the category. They're metaphysical things. When I first started researching in 2016, I heard about psychic abilities. I haven't tried to explore them myself to become psychic. I think we all have the ability to be intuitive. But I did work with some people who do this professionally. And I said, well, if it's real, some people should be able to do it. And I've had many crazy experiences. The one that's popping to mind, because you mentioned David Hawkins, okay? And I don't do this as much anymore. So I looked up who are some of the really good psychics, including psychics that have been tested in scientific settings. The University of Arizona, Dr. Gary Schwartz, has tested many psychic mediums, so people who claim they can communicate with the dead. The Windbridge Research Center has done studies on this with 5 levels of blinding. So I give the preface because there is some science. And not every psychic is good. They don't always get it right. But I was speaking with one. This was around the time I finished the first draft of my book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, so 2017. And I was speaking with a psychic medium, and the day before I had finished the draft, I had included David Hawkins' work at the end of the book, and I was so excited because I love his philosophy. And I was excited I was able to integrate his philosophy into my book that was otherwise scientific. So I'm on the phone with her. She doesn't know me beyond being on the phone. And she says, have you come across the work of David Hawkins? He's deceased. And she said, well, he is guiding your work from the other side, meaning his consciousness is steering your work. And I just stopped for a second because I said, how does she come up with David Hawkins? There's a lot of authors out there, and I just wrote about him yesterday. I was very excited to include him in my book. So I've had a number of experiences like that that are very hard to explain.
I think it's very special to experience that.
Yeah.
What is your mission or dream for the coming years?
Well, for me personally is to be in alignment with things that I find to be passionate. And I would love to see a better world where more and more people are asking these questions, because it feels like there's a lot of tyranny that we have already experienced, but it's only becoming more and more tyrannical. So I would love to see a more awakened world where people are not allowing it, and they're not being swayed by something that sounds like it's compassionate, but actually it's tyrannical.
Yeah. Is there, at the end of the podcast, Mark, something else you want to share or tell? I
would say that this journey, if members of your audience are interested or already on the path, is it seems like it is positive in the long run, but there can be ups and downs and bumps on the road because there's a lot of shedding that we all have to do of old belief systems, and that means beliefs about the world around us, but also our own internal beliefs about ourselves. And it's not an overnight process. So just to be patient with ourselves, to say this can take time. But to me, what's most important is to have the end goal, to have our compass set in a new direction. And once we set the compass in that direction, in the long term, we will be in a better place.
Yeah, and magic can happen.
Yeah, for sure.
I will touch the Dutch listeners and viewers where they can purchase your translated books in Dutch. But where can people find more about you, your podcast, and your English books?
My website is a good place to start. It's markgober.com, markgober.com. And my books are all on Amazon. In English, they're in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible. I read the Audibles myself. And also my podcast series, Where Is My Mind? Even though it was produced in 2019, it's still very relevant because it talks about consciousness. And that's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the major players.
Great. Voor de Dutch listeners en viewers. 2 boeken van Mark zijn door Succesboeken in het Nederlands vertaald. Voor de kijkers zie je ze hier staan onder de titels: Een einde aan de omgekeerde wereld van geneeskunde en Een einde aan de omgekeerde wereld van vrijheid. En ga voor deze boeken naar www.succesboeken.nl. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
And all the best with your beautiful work and with your 7th book and with everything you do in this world.
Thank you so much and best of luck to you too, Richard.
Thank you, Mark.
De Oersterk podcast wordt je gratis aangeboden door Oersterk, het platform voor een beter leven. Het is onze missie om 1 miljoen mensen te begeleiden naar een beter leven door middel van de juiste zelfzorg. Wil je weten hoe jij kunt werken aan een beter leven? Ga dan naar www.oersterk.nu/gezondheidscheck voor onze gratis gezondheidscheck en krijg direct jouw uitslag met persoonlijk advies.